The screech of tires broke the calm of the evening, and Angela Carter's heart sank as red and blue lights flashed behind her. The harsh pulse of sirens cut through the quiet street like a knife, sending ripples of tension through her chest. She instinctively glanced at the rearview mirror, her breath hitching. It had been a long day. Too long. And now this. The soft hum of her Tesla's engine seemed too quiet against the escalating noise outside, the flashing lights threatening to drag her back into the harsh reality of a world she was always trying to escape. She pulled to the side of the road, the tires whispering against the asphalt as she came to a slow stop. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel, her fingers slipping a bit on the smooth leather. She took a steadying breath, trying to shake the unsettling feeling crawling up her spine. Angela's pregnant belly pressed lightly against the seatbelt, a reminder of the fragile new life growing inside her. She wasn't just carrying a child. She was carrying the weight of her career, her ambitions, her fear. Being pregnant at this stage of her life, with all she had built, had been no small decision. It came with its share of doubt, moments of weakness, but also immense pride. She could juggle it all, couldn't she? The flashing lights in her rearview mirror were a stark interruption to the world she had worked so hard to build. The world where she was in control, where she made decisions that shaped not only her future but the future of the very system she was a part of. She was the head of internal affairs for the state, a position earned through years of discipline, sacrifice, and an unyielding belief in justice. But tonight, as she waited in the car, the air thick with uncertainty, that power seemed like something far away. The car behind her had been tailing her too closely, almost aggressively, as if daring her to do something wrong. And now, the sirens. Angela's grip tightened again on the wheel as she stared straight ahead, trying to will herself to stay calm. Every breath she took was measured, slow. It wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over, but something about tonight felt different. A strange, prickling sensation crawled along her skin. The sound of boots on pavement echoed in the quiet of the night, growing louder as the officer approached her car. She swallowed, trying to push the unease down. This wasn't about fear. This was about respect, power, and the dangerous unknown of what might unfold next. Angela knew the script all too well. She'd been trained for moments like this. She knew how to handle officers, how to de-escalate tension, how to command respect. But tonight, with the weight of her pregnancy pressing down on her, she didn't know if it would be enough. The officer's shadow loomed larger against her windshield, and as he came into view, his face hardened into something she couldn't quite place. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes, cold, detached. Angela took a deep breath and shifted her gaze to the side mirror, her eyes narrowing, wondering if this was going to be just another routine stop, or something far more dangerous. Angela Carter sat in her car, staring at the rearview mirror as the officer's shadow drew closer. The street around her was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft hum of her Tesla's engine. She had always loved this neighborhood, suburban, well-kept, safe. The kind of place where the biggest concerns were local politics or school fundraisers. The kind of place where people like her, successful, respected, could feel invisible if they wanted. She was used to the stillness of her late-night drives home. It had become a ritual. After a long day of meetings, conference calls, and endless reports, she'd drive back to her sleek modern home, her sanctuary. The white walls, the clean lines, the understated luxury that reflected not just her success, but her inner desire to control everything around her. To create a space where she could finally breathe, where the world outside couldn't reach her. But tonight was different. Tonight, the silence felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Angela hadn't been expecting this. She'd been expecting to get home, take a warm shower, maybe have a glass of wine. The last thing she'd wanted was to deal with another police officer. Not tonight, not after the kind of day she'd had. Her thoughts were interrupted by the officer's heavy footsteps drawing near. The crisp echo of his boots against the pavement sent a shiver through her. She glanced in the side mirror. The officer was tall, with broad shoulders and a posture that screamed authority. But it wasn't the authority of someone who wanted to protect. It was the kind of power that came with suspicion, judgment, and a simmering distaste for anyone who didn't fit into the rigid mold of what he deemed acceptable. Angela shifted her focus back to the front. She forced herself to remain calm, to stay composed. But as she placed her hand over her rounded belly, a flicker of vulnerability tugged at her. She was pregnant, nearly 7 months along, with a life growing inside her, a reminder of all she was fighting for. She was a woman in a man's world, a powerful executive, a force to be reckoned with. But tonight, she felt exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just a woman now. She was a mother, a protector. And the thought of someone threatening that, even in the smallest way, made her blood boil. The officer's steps came to a halt just beside her window. Angela's hands tightened around the steering wheel, her knuckles going white. She had faced much worse than this in her career. Confrontations, accusations, threats. But this was different. This was personal. The officer didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, casting a long shadow over the car. His posture was stiff, almost combative. His gaze flicked to the window but didn't meet hers. Angela's eyes narrowed. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, thick with tension. Finally, he stepped forward and tapped on the glass. It wasn't a polite knock, but an almost deliberate rap that felt like an intrusion. Angela rolled the window down slowly, not out of fear, but to control the moment. Her lips pressed into a thin line, prepared for whatever was coming next. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone harsh, clipped. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of her presence beyond the direct command. His voice carried a coldness that sent a ripple of discomfort through her. Angela's fingers moved toward the glove compartment, her movements deliberate. She was calculating, always calculating. In a world where she had fought for every inch of respect, every step forward, she knew how important it was to control these moments. To not let them see you flinch. To stand your ground, no matter the circumstances. The officer watched her carefully, his eyes scanning her every movement. Angela noticed the way his gaze lingered on her hands, on her pregnant belly. A small, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. It was subtle, but it didn't escape her. The way his gaze lingered just a little too long, the way his lips twisted in a tight, controlled line as if trying to place her, to figure her out. She could feel it, an undercurrent of judgment in the air. She handed him the registration, her movements smooth, practiced. She didn't speak at first. She didn't have to. This wasn't about pleasantries. This was about power. The officer took the papers, his eyes briefly glancing at them before moving back to her face. Angela met his gaze evenly, her chin tilted slightly upward, as if daring him to challenge her. "Everything in order?" she asked, her voice steady, but edged with a question he hadn't yet answered. For a moment, the officer didn't respond. His eyes seemed to flicker over her once more, scanning her appearance. Her well-coiffed hair, her tailored suit, the gleam of her polished nails. There was something about her that didn't fit his expectations. His eyes narrowed, as if piecing together a puzzle. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Angela's next words came out, calculated, cutting through the rising tension. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone now slightly more authoritative. She knew how to play this game. She had played it for years. She was used to commanding respect in rooms full of men who saw her as just another woman. She was used to being underestimated, and she knew how to use that against them. The officer hesitated for a moment, his fingers twitching slightly around the papers in his hand. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for her calm, controlled demeanor. He had expected someone nervous, maybe intimidated. Instead, he found himself looking into the eyes of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "Just making sure everything checks out," he muttered, clearly thrown off balance by her unwavering composure. He took a step back, glancing toward the cruiser for a moment as if considering his next move. Angela, however, didn't relax. She kept her eyes locked on his, her posture straight, her mind calculating the possible outcomes. She could feel the growing tension between them, but she refused to back down. She had too much to lose, and she wasn't going to let him or anyone else take it from her. Her mind raced. There had been whispers about the local police force, whispers of unchecked bias, of racial profiling, of officers who treated people like her with disdain. She had heard the stories, seen the reports. But this felt different. She didn't know why, but she felt like this officer wasn't just going through the motions. He wasn't simply doing his job. There was something deeper here, but whatever it was, Angela wasn't going to let it stand. Not tonight. Not ever. The officer's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror before returning to Angela. A subtle but deliberate pause that lingered a little too long. The moment felt like an eternity, each second stretched thin with the weight of unspoken judgment. Angela held his gaze, her posture still rigid, her thoughts racing, trying to decipher what had caused the shift in his demeanor. It wasn't just the professional indifference of a routine traffic stop. No, there was something colder beneath it, something personal. She could feel the tension coiling tighter with every passing second, the air between them thickening with a strange, almost suffocating energy. Angela's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something far more unsettling. The officer's scrutiny had shifted. It was no longer about paperwork, no longer about following the procedures of a routine traffic stop. This was something else. A flash of movement to her right caught her eye. Another patrol car, pulling up alongside the first. A second officer stepped out, his posture just as stiff as the first, his expression equally unreadable. They were flanking her now like predators closing in on prey, and Angela's stomach twisted. She quickly suppressed the instinct to panic. The last thing she needed was to appear weak, to let them see her flinch. Angela had been in high-stakes situations before, had faced pressure and scrutiny in boardrooms, courtrooms, even within her own department. But this felt different. In her gut, she could already sense what was coming. The second officer, a younger man with a clean-shaven face and the same detached expression, walked toward her window, his eyes scanning the interior of the car before settling on her face. The first officer, Jenkins, took a step back, allowing his colleague to take over. His presence, however, still loomed in the background, his eyes never leaving her as if silently calculating something. Angela's grip on the steering wheel tightened, the leather creaking under her fingers. She had learned long ago how to handle difficult situations, how to read people, how to manipulate the narrative to her advantage. But what was she dealing with now? Was this a simple misunderstanding? Or had something more sinister already begun to unfold? "Evening, ma'am," the younger officer said, his tone barely cordial, lacking the usual politeness that was expected when addressing someone in a respectable position. He didn't say anything about her pregnancy, but the way his eyes darted to her belly for a fraction of a second before quickly looking away made it clear that he had noticed. He was sizing her up. Angela could feel the judgment, feel the undercurrent of something unspoken swirling around them. "Good evening, officer," she replied, keeping her voice calm, even. But beneath the surface, something was churning. She couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. There was a flicker of something darker in the way the officers had positioned themselves, the way they circled her like hawks, waiting for any slip. "We pulled you over because you were driving too close to the vehicle in front of you," the officer continued, his tone professional but flat, devoid of the usual warmth. Is there a reason for that? Angela's eyes narrowed. This wasn't adding up. She had been driving within the speed limit, her distance from the car ahead of her completely reasonable. She didn't remember tailgating, didn't remember any erratic driving. Her mind flashed back to the moments before the sirens had gone off, replaying the drive in her head. Nothing stood out. Nothing that would warrant this kind of attention. "I don't believe I was tailgating, officer," she said, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of frustration now creeping in. "I was driving safely." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the window, his face inches from hers, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something. An excuse, a crack in her calm facade, anything he could latch on to. "License and registration," he repeated, his voice colder this time, more insistent. Angela handed him the documents again, her hand steady despite the increasing tension in the air. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't just a woman in a car anymore. She wasn't just someone who could be brushed off or intimidated. She was the head of internal affairs, and she knew exactly how to navigate these kinds of situations. But still, there was something about the way they were acting that gnawed at her insides. The officer took the papers, glancing at them for the briefest of moments before his eyes flicked back to Angela's face. The longer he looked, the more uncomfortable she felt. The scrutiny, the subtle challenge in his gaze, it was as if he was waiting for something. Waiting for her to slip, to show any sign of fear or uncertainty. But Angela wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. As the officer turned away, Angela's thoughts spun. What was happening here? This wasn't a routine stop. She could feel it in her bones. The way they were acting, the way they were circling her, they were sizing her up, looking for any reason to escalate things. Behind her, the first officer, Jenkins, remained silent. He had taken a step back, but his presence was still palpable, heavy in the air, suffocating. Angela knew he was watching closely, his eyes trained on her every move. She could feel his gaze even through the rear-view mirror. "Everything in order?" she asked again, her voice crisp and measured, daring them to explain themselves, to give her some clarity on why they were making this more difficult than it needed to be. The younger officer glanced at Jenkins, then back at her, as if searching for an answer. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand briefly hovering over his holstered gun. Angela noticed the subtle movement, and a jolt of tension shot through her. Was he prepared to escalate this further? Had she done something to provoke him without even realizing it? There it was again, the flicker of something darker in his eyes, something barely concealed beneath the surface. "You're free to go, ma'am," he said finally, but the words were clipped, almost resentful, as if he had been forced to back down. He handed her the documents, his fingers brushing hers briefly, the touch cold and impersonal. Angela didn't take them right away. She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze sharp. "Is there anything else, officer?" Jenkins finally spoke up, his voice low but stern. "Just be careful next time, ma'am. We don't tolerate reckless driving around here." Angela's blood boiled, but she kept her face neutral. They were trying to provoke her. She could feel it. They had no legitimate reason to stop her, no reason to escalate this further. This was about power. This was about control. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart pounding in her chest, and finally reached for her documents, slipping them back into the glove compartment with deliberate calmness. As she started the car, she could see them both standing there, watching her. They had failed to get the response they wanted, but Angela knew they were still silently judging her, still deciding whether or not to push things further. She drove off, her mind racing. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The tension in the air hung thick, like the distant hum of a storm, gathering strength just beyond the horizon. Angela's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter than before. the leather cool and unforgiving beneath her palms. As she eased her Tesla back onto the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror once again, watching the officers retreat into the shadows of their squad cars. The flashing lights in her mirror began to fade, but the sense of unease didn't. It lingered, like the heavy weight of a storm cloud, dark and threatening. For a moment, she let herself breathe, allowing the steady hum of the car's electric engine to soothe her nerves. The road ahead was clear, the city's neon glow flickering in the distance like a beacon. But even as she exhaled, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That the officers hadn't let her go with the calm finality of a routine stop. There was something beneath the surface, an unspoken tension, a hint of malice in their silence that had set her instincts on high alert. Angela's hand shifted to her stomach, the soft curve of her belly pressing against the seatbelt. A quiet reminder of the precious life inside her, and a stark contrast to the aggression that had just unfolded. She was the embodiment of contradiction, power and vulnerability all at once. A woman at the peak of her career, yet carrying the delicate promise of motherhood. She had always navigated the complexities of her life with a sense of control, but this felt different. As she turned a corner, the lights of the city just visible in the distance, she noticed something in the rearview mirror that made her blood run cold. A flash of headlights, the unmistakable shape of a patrol car, the same two officers. Her heart skipped a beat. Angela's mind raced as she kept her foot steady on the accelerator. She didn't make any immediate moves. She couldn't. The officer behind her had clearly chosen to follow her, and in that moment, Angela realized the first mistake she had made, letting them think they could control the situation. The patrol car was getting closer, its headlights now blinding in the mirror, the whine of its engine growing louder. She glanced around, eyes scanning for any exit, any way to break free from the growing tension. She had no desire to engage with them again. Not like this. Not with their eyes fixed on her, not when she could already sense the underlying hostility in their every movement. "Not this time," she muttered under her breath. She did what she knew best, kept calm. She couldn't let herself fall into panic. Whatever their intentions, they were going to push her boundaries, test her resolve, maybe even try to break her composure. But she wouldn't let that happen. She had spent too long building her career to be intimidated, to let them take her down with a few well-placed words or veiled threats. The last thing she needed was to lose herself in an encounter with these men. It would ruin everything she had worked for. Suddenly, the sirens blared again, cutting through the calm night air, sharp and insistent. The lights flashed in her mirrors, and Angela's stomach tightened in response. She sighed, then pulled over to the side of the road. This time, her movements were deliberate, calculated. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. No, tonight, she was going to hold her ground. The officer's silhouette appeared again in the dim light, a shadow creeping toward her just like before. She could see his movements through the rearview mirror, slow, deliberate, as if each step was measured, as if he was savoring the moment. Her instincts screamed that this was not going to end the way it had last time. This wasn't going to be a simple, "Be careful next time," warning. The moment his boots hit the pavement, Angela's body stiffened. She tried to remind herself that she had dealt with far worse, far more aggressive men than this, men who had doubted her, undermined her. But tonight, the officers were different. Tonight, they felt like a reminder of everything that was wrong with the system she had spent her career trying to change. The officer approached the window again, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap. He didn't say anything right away, just hovered there, standing close enough that Angela could smell the faint scent of cheap aftershave mixed with the unmistakable odor of stale coffee. She tried not to inhale too deeply. It was a distraction, a small thing, but a thing that kept her grounded. He was trying to intimidate her. She could feel it. His proximity, his silence, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long before he finally spoke. "Out of the car," he ordered, his voice thick with an edge of command. The words were a demand, not a request. They struck her like a slap, cold and unexpected. Angela's mind reeled and her breath caught in her throat. Out of the car? It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It wasn't just a matter of paperwork or questions. This was something else entirely. He wasn't asking. He was ordering, and that was a line she couldn't allow him to cross. "No," Angela replied sharply, her voice unwavering. She wasn't going to comply, not without a reason. The officer's lips twisted in frustration, and she could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. A flash of anger flared in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a forced, steely calm. "Ma'am, I'm telling you to step out of the vehicle." Angela glanced at the other officer, Jenkins, who had moved closer, his hands still casually resting near his gun holster, but his eyes never leaving her. There was a calm menace in his gaze, as if he were waiting for her to make a mistake. She didn't flinch. Instead, Angela's gaze remained steady, unwavering. She met the officer's eyes and saw the challenge in them, the silent dare. She knew what he wanted. He wanted her to move first, to show any sign of weakness. He was counting on her to be afraid. But she wasn't afraid. "No," Angela repeated, her voice clear, even. "You have no reason to ask me to step out of the car. This is harassment." The officer's face reddened slightly, but he didn't back down. His hand hovered over his radio for a moment as if considering his next move. Jenkins took another step forward, his eyes narrowed, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "I said step out of the car," the officer snapped. His tone had shifted. No longer polite, no longer professional. This was a demand, a test. Angela's heart began to pound in her chest. The situation had shifted from an inconvenient traffic stop to a potential confrontation. A small part of her, some deep, buried instinct, knew it was time to get out, to walk away. But she couldn't. Not without risking everything she had worked for. Not without making a stand. "You don't have a reason to make me step out of the vehicle," she said, her voice now firm, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. The officer's nostrils flared, and his jaw clenched in frustration. The tension was palpable now, thick in the air between them. He reached for his radio, tapping it once before speaking into it with a sharp, authoritative voice. "We need backup here. Now." Angela's pulse quickened. She knew what this meant. Backup meant escalation. Backup meant the situation was about to get ugly. The officers had already crossed a line, and now they were calling for reinforcements. She was about to be swallowed by a system she had spent her entire career trying to dismantle. "You're making a huge mistake," Angela said, her voice steady despite the storm of adrenaline now crashing through her veins. "You know who I am, don't you?" She didn't wait for an answer. Didn't wait for them to try to justify their actions. She didn't need them to understand. She just needed to make it clear that she was not going down without a fight. She had built too much, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to let this moment define her. "Let's see if you really want to escalate this," she said quietly, but with enough steel in her voice to make the challenge clear. The officer stood frozen for a moment, his hand still on the radio, his mind whirling as he processed the implications of her words. Behind him, Jenkins' eyes flickered with the faintest hint of recognition. Angela could see it, the moment he realized who she was. But it was too late for apologies, too late for them to back down. The escalation had already begun. The world around Angela seemed to slow. The distant hum of city traffic, the cold night air, the harsh flicker of the patrol car's lights, all of it faded into the background as she focused on the officer in front of her. His hand was still hovering over the radio, but now it trembled just the slightest bit. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of something else, something like realization, dawning in his mind. Angela knew in that moment that he had finally recognized who she was. She could see it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that passed through them. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped, as if everything hinged on the next word, the next move, the next breath they all took. Angela inhaled slowly, but her body was calm. Her heartbeat wasn't fast, nor was it slow. It was steady. She had made the decision to stop running from whatever this was, and in the same instant, she realized that this wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about what they were trying to do to her in this moment, in this traffic stop. It was about the bigger picture, the systems that had always existed, designed to trap people like her, to tear them down when they dared to push back, to make them invisible. But Angela Carter wasn't invisible. And now, in this moment, she wasn't going to let them make her small. The officer in front of her blinked, as if breaking out of a trance. His hand dropped from the radio and his eyes moved over to Jenkins, who was standing just behind him, waiting. The younger officer's shoulders had stiffened, but his posture betrayed a growing uncertainty. Something had changed. Something was different. Angela leaned forward just slightly so that her face was framed in the dim glow of the patrol car's lights. She didn't say anything immediately. She just let the silence between them grow. It was deliberate. It was calculated. She was letting the weight of her presence settle over him like a slow-moving tide, watching as he realized the full scope of the miscalculation they had made by escalating things. She could feel his thoughts spiraling. He had crossed a line, one he wasn't sure he could come back from. "Do you know who I am?" Angela asked, her voice steady, but carrying an edge that cut through the tension. The officer's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near his belt. For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply stared at her, the hardened lines of his face faltering as the truth began to sink in. "I'm the head of internal affairs for the state police," Angela continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I oversee officers like you. Your behavior, your actions. This is not how you conduct a traffic stop. And this is definitely not how you treat a civilian." Her words fell like stone into the silence, and the impact reverberated through the night air. The younger officer shifted, his stance loosening slightly, as though the armor of authority he had been wearing was beginning to crack. Jenkins, the older officer, took a subtle step back, his eyes flicking between Angela and his partner. She could see the change in his posture. More cautious now, more aware. But there was something else in his eyes, a quiet flicker of uncertainty, of guilt, maybe even a little bit of fear. The younger officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was floundering, caught between his orders and the dawning realization of his mistake. Angela wasn't just a random woman. She wasn't some powerless civilian to be treated with disdain. She was someone who held power, authority, a woman who could expose the very system they operated within. "I don't think you realize what you've just done," Angela said, leaning forward even more, her voice cutting through the air like a razor. She could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on them both. The knowledge that she wasn't just any bystander, any woman. She was a force. The officer opened his mouth again, and this time his voice came out in a strained, apologetic tone. "Ma'am, No," Angela interrupted, her voice firm, cutting through the apology. "You don't get to apologize now. You don't get to act like this is just some mistake that can be brushed under the rug. You've escalated this situation unnecessarily. You've crossed a line." She paused, letting the words linger in the air. Her chest was tight with the weight of the truth she was about to reveal, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. "You made the mistake of underestimating me," she said, her voice rising with the surge of authority she felt inside. "And now you'll answer for it. Your career is on the line, everything you've done up until now. It's on the table." The words felt heavy on her tongue, but the satisfaction of knowing she was no longer playing the role of the compliant citizen, the passive observer, was intoxicating. For so long, she had lived within the confines of a system that didn't want to hear her voice. But now, in this moment, Angela's words were a weapon. They were her declaration of power, her demand for respect. Behind her, Jenkins shifted his weight from foot to foot, and for a split second she saw a crack in his calm exterior. There it was, the moment when he understood exactly how serious this was. When he understood that Angela wasn't just a civilian, wasn't just a pregnant woman in a car. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had the ability to hold his and his partner's fate in her hands. "Your internal affairs?" The younger officer's voice was small now, hesitant. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by the cold realization that he had made a dangerous mistake. Angela nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I think you know what that means. I'm the one who investigates misconduct. I'm the one who makes sure officers like you are held accountable when they step out of line. And you've stepped out of line." Jenkins took another small step back, his expression unreadable now. He was calculating, assessing the situation, weighing his options. Angela could see it. The moment when he began to realize the gravity of what they had just done. He was no longer the officer in control. In that split second, she had taken it all back. She had turned the tables. The younger officer finally looked away, his eyes darting down to the pavement, unable to meet her gaze any longer. He was realizing the full weight of the situation now, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile his actions with the reality that was unfolding in front of him. "You don't know what you're doing," Jenkins finally said, his voice lower now, the earlier arrogance gone from his tone. "You can't just—" "I can, and I will," Angela cut him off, her voice ice cold. "You're going to report this to your superior. You're going to tell them exactly what happened here tonight, and you're going to understand that I will be looking into this." Jenkins faltered, his eyes narrowing, as if debating whether to argue or back down. For a moment, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. But Angela wasn't done. "I'll be contacting your precinct in the morning," she said, her voice sharp with resolve. "And I'll make sure everything is documented. This won't be brushed under the rug. You won't sweep this away." The younger officer, his face pale, shifted uneasily. Angela could see him trying to gather the words to apologize, to backpedal, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The moment of power had shifted entirely. They had given her the control, and now they had to face the consequences. "I'm going to ask you one more time, officer," Angela said, her voice now soft but commanding, "to take a step back and consider what you're about to do." The officer hesitated, and Angela saw it. The last flicker of hesitation, the final struggle between ego and reason. The realization that this wasn't just a simple traffic stop anymore. This was about moral accountability, about knowing when to admit defeat. The officer turned away. He didn't say another word. And for the first time since this had all started, Angela felt something she hadn't felt in the entire encounter, the deep, resonating satisfaction of victory. The storm was over, and she had emerged stronger for it. She sat back in her seat, taking a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline ebb away. She had made her stand. And in doing so, she had rewritten the narrative. The quiet that settled over the scene after the officer turned away was almost surreal. Angela watched him retreat to the safety of his squad car, the weight of the decision still heavy in her chest. He didn't look back. Neither did Jenkins. The tension, which had threatened to spiral out of control just moments before, now hung in the air like an unspoken truce, fragile and tenuous. The flashing lights, once a suffocating presence, dimmed as the officers climbed back into their vehicle, their voices muffled by the distance between them. Angela's heart, which had been racing in her chest, began to slow, the rush of adrenaline fading into something else, a quiet, intense relief. The worst was over. But that wasn't all. There was more. There was always more. She knew what this encounter meant. It wasn't just a small victory in the moment. This was bigger. It was a reminder of the power she had, not just in her position, but in her identity, in the unyielding force of her presence. She had made a choice to stand up, to hold her ground, and she had won. But that victory came with its own weight, one she didn't yet fully understand. In that moment, as the patrol car's engine roared to life and the blue and red lights blinked off, she knew that her actions had reverberated beyond the asphalt and beyond the broken silence of the night. It had sent a message to the officers, to the people who watched, and to herself. The officers were gone now, and Angela, still sitting in her car, let herself take a long, steadying breath. Her hand, still resting lightly on her stomach, felt the subtle rise and fall of her breath, a steady rhythm of calm. Her pregnancy, which had seemed like a delicate private thing only hours ago, had suddenly become a symbol of her resilience. She wasn't just a woman in a car, afraid of being harassed. She was someone who would not let this world define her. Angela pulled her phone from the passenger seat and dialed a number she knew by heart, the number that had become a lifeline during times of uncertainty. She needed to hear a familiar voice. She needed the comfort of someone who could offer her perspective. Her phone buzzed, and then the voice on the other end came through, soothing and warm, as if there had been no interruption in the course of their lives. "Angela, everything okay?" It was Greg, her husband. The concern in his voice was immediate, and she could feel his protective instinct come through even across the miles. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "Just dealing with a situation. It's over now." There was a pause, a long one. Before Greg spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I heard about the traffic stop. Are you sure you're okay?" Angela let out a slow, calming breath. It was a question that required more than a simple answer. The truth was, she wasn't just okay. She wasn't just fine. But she didn't want to explain it all yet, not right now. Not when the adrenaline was still surging through her veins and the weight of the night was just beginning to sink in. "I'm okay," she repeated. "It's just one of those moments, you know? You don't realize how much you're holding until you're forced to let it out. But I'm all right." Greg let out a soft sigh on the other end. "I don't know what to say, Ange. I'm glad you're okay, but I hate that this is still happening. I hate that we have to deal with things like this, even now." Angela nodded, though he couldn't see her. She could hear the frustration in his voice, the anger that mirrored her own. She knew he felt the weight of it all just as she did, but there was something else in his words, something Angela needed to hear. He was with her. He understood the battle she was fighting. "I know," she said softly, "but we can't change it unless we fight. And sometimes that means standing up when no one expects you to. Tonight, I stood up, and it mattered." "I'm proud of you," Greg said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want you to know that. No matter what happens next, I'm proud of you. And I love you." The words wrapped around Angela like a blanket. It wasn't just the love she needed, though that was certainly a part of it. It was the recognition of the battle she was fighting, not just as an individual, but as someone who would keep pushing forward, someone who would demand justice, even when it seemed impossible. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but her words carrying the weight of everything she felt in that moment. "I love you too." She hung up, her mind still buzzing. There would be a time to process this moment fully, but it wasn't now. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by the enormity of what had just happened. The evening was already slipping away, the quiet darkness creeping back into the edges of her consciousness. And yet something had shifted inside her, something she couldn't ignore. She looked out at the empty road ahead. The streetlights cast long, soft shadows across the pavement. There was a slight chill in the air, but it felt like a new beginning. Angela was aware of the stillness in the world around her, the way the night seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for her next move. As she turned the key in the ignition, she allowed herself one last breath, steady and calming. The car purred to life, and she began to pull back onto the road, her hands still steady on the wheel, her mind clear. There was a long journey ahead, one that would require patience, perseverance, and courage. But she was ready. And as she drove away, Angela knew that the world she had just confronted wasn't one she could change in a single night. It wasn't one she could fix with a single act of defiance. But what she had done tonight, the way she had stood her ground, the way she had demanded respect, was the first step. She was just one woman, one mother-to-be, but she wasn't alone. There were countless others like her, silently fighting, quietly resisting the systems that had been built to oppress them. And together, they could create change. The road stretched out before her, open and wide, and Angela Carter, now more than ever, was ready to walk it. As she drove, Angela's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. What had just happened was part of a broader, long-term struggle, a fight that couldn't be won in a moment, but would require persistence, unity, and unwavering determination. Angela had taken a stand tonight. But it wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. She would make sure of that. The days following Angela's encounter with the officers felt like a strange blur of emotions, a cocktail of relief, pride, and a simmering undercurrent of something more, something that wouldn't let her rest, even for a moment. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the flash of the patrol car's lights, hear the sharp click of the officer's pen as he jotted down her information, feel the tension in the air like static electricity. But unlike other nights, this one didn't fade into the past. It lingered, a lingering echo in her thoughts, reminding her of the weight of what she had done. She had expected the story to vanish, swallowed up by the sea of similar headlines, unnoticed by the wider world. But instead, it had found its way into the conversation. Word spread. The story of the pregnant woman who'd taken a stand against injustice, who'd turned a routine traffic stop into a showdown with a powerful system. Her story became a symbol. It wasn't long before Angela's phone began to ring with calls from people she barely knew. Journalists, activists, and strangers who had heard about her bravery. They wanted to know how she had found the strength to speak up. They wanted to hear her story. They wanted her voice to carry beyond the confines of her immediate struggle. At first, she resisted the attention, wanting to simply return to her life, to be the mother-to-be who spent her days with her family, her evenings curled up with a book. But as the calls grew more frequent and the conversations more urgent, Angela realized something she hadn't expected. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, to everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to everyone who had ever endured the quiet weight of injustice and discrimination. One evening, as Angela was preparing dinner, the phone rang again. She glanced at the screen and saw the name of the state senator's office flash across it. She had heard of the senator. He was a vocal advocate for police reform, someone who had spoken out on many occasions about the need for change within the justice system. Angela hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello? Ms. Carter?" A voice on the other end was familiar, but Angela couldn't place it immediately. "Yes, this is Angela," she replied, still unsure. "This is Marissa Dutton with Senator Turner's office. We've been following the situation that took place last week with you and the officers. The senator was deeply moved by what you did, and we'd like to speak with you about possibly working together on some of the upcoming police reform legislation." Angela froze, the knife she had been using to chop vegetables suddenly still in her hand. She had never been involved in politics. She had always viewed herself as just another person trying to get through the day. She didn't belong in these spaces. But something about Marissa's words, their weight, the sincerity in her voice, felt different. Angela wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a catalyst. Angela cleared her throat, finding her voice. I'm not sure what you mean exactly. I'm just a woman who got caught up in a bad situation. That's exactly it, Ms. Carter, Marissa said, her tone unwavering. You didn't just get caught up, you stood up, and that's what we need to see more of. We need voices like yours, people who are directly impacted by this system, to help us shape the change we're working toward. Senator Turner is very interested in having a conversation with you, if you're open to it. Angela took a deep breath, the full weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that could reach beyond her personal experience and speak to the struggles that countless others faced every day. For the first time, Angela felt her own power, the potential to influence the world in ways she never imagined. I'm open to it, she said, her voice more confident than she had expected. Let's talk. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Angela was thrust into a world she had always observed from the sidelines: meetings, phone calls, letters, and briefings on police reform initiatives. At first, it was overwhelming. The language was foreign, the stakes higher than anything she had ever imagined. But as she dug deeper into the work, as she listened to the stories of others who had fought this fight for years, Angela began to understand her place in it. She wasn't just a passive observer. She was a participant in something that could change the world. She met with the senator, with activists, with victims of police brutality, and families who had lost loved ones to unjust violence. Each story tore at her heart in a different way, but they also fueled her determination. Angela wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for her unborn child, for her community, for all those who would come after her. She had been the one to stand up, but now she saw the collective power of voices united in purpose. Her story was just one piece of a much larger narrative. On a chilly morning, a few weeks later, Angela stood before a group of activists, journalists, and community leaders at a press conference, holding her ground as they asked her questions about the encounter with the officers and her newfound role in the movement. She was calm, poised, and firm in her answers. The camera flashes that went off didn't shake her. She had learned to use her voice, to make it count in the spaces that mattered. But what struck her the most wasn't the crowd or the cameras. It was the message she was delivering. It wasn't just about speaking up in the face of adversity. It was about showing others that they could do the same. Angela was no longer just the woman in the traffic stop. She was a beacon for a movement that had been waiting for its next wave of change. The stories of people like her, who had endured systemic racism, injustice, and violence, were being heard. And Angela knew that the change wasn't going to come in an instant. It would take time, persistence, and sacrifice. But every moment she spent sharing her story, every step she took in this new role, was one step closer to making sure that the world would be different for her child, for the next generation, for everyone who had felt the weight of oppression. Months passed, and Angela's life continued to evolve. Her family grew. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and as she held him in her arms for the first time, she felt the immense responsibility of what she was trying to build for him. A world where he wouldn't have to face the same injustices she had encountered. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the fight was far from over, but she had the strength now, she had the courage, and she had the community to back her. In the end, Angela's stand at the traffic stop became the catalyst for something larger than any single individual. It was a turning point in her own life, but also in the ongoing fight for racial justice, accountability, and equality. She had been a witness to the system's failings, But now she was part of the solution, working alongside those who had been pushing for change long before her. Angela's fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And she knew, without a doubt, that she was ready. Angela Carter's story is not just one of a woman standing up in the face of adversity. It is a story that belongs to all of us. The collective story of those who have been silenced, overlooked, and oppressed by a system that has long favored power over justice. Angela's courage wasn't just in the moment of confrontation, it was in her willingness to face the truth, to speak out, and to transform her personal experience into a powerful call for change. But this story isn't just hers. It's yours too. Every time you see an injustice, every time you witness something that feels wrong or unfair, you have a choice. You can look away, or you can stand up. You can be silent, or you can use your voice. The world needs more people like Angela, people who refuse to accept the status quo, who challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality, and who demand better for themselves, their children, and their communities. The question now is, what will you do with the lessons learned from Angela's experience? Will you let it pass as just another story, or will you allow it to ignite something within you? The fight for social justice is not an easy one. It requires strength, perseverance, and above all, a commitment to standing firm even when the odds are against you. But it is a fight worth having, because every small victory, every moment of courage adds up, and together, we can change the world. If Angela's story moved you, then consider what you can do in your own life to make a difference. It could be as simple as speaking out against discrimination when you see it, or as impactful as joining a movement dedicated to reforming the justice system. But the most important thing is to do something. Don't let fear, complacency, or indifference stop you from acting. Ask yourself, what does justice look like to me? And then go out and be part of creating it. The change you want to see doesn't happen on its own. It happens through the actions of those who refuse to sit back and wait for someone else to make it happen. Angela chose to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who has faced similar challenges. She refused to be intimidated or silenced. And now, it's your turn. Start by educating yourself on the issues that matter. Read about the injustices that people face, listen to voices that have been marginalized, and learn the history of those who have fought before you. Knowledge is power. Then, take that knowledge and use it to start conversations, to raise awareness, and to push for change. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need the courage to begin. This is your moment. Angela's story may have sparked something in you, but what happens next is entirely up to you. We can all make a difference, whether it's standing up in a moment of injustice, speaking out when silence feels easier, or advocating for systemic change. Your voice matters. So I challenge you. What will you do with your voice? What will you do with your power? The time for action is now. Share this story. Share your thoughts. And subscribe to follow more stories of courage, justice, and hope. Because together, we are stronger. And together, we can create a world that is fair, just, and free of oppression. Let Angela's story inspire you to stand up and take action. The change begins with you.